the recording. And yes, this is Topics in American Literature, English 2130 at Tech this fall, Tennessee Tech, instructor Andrew William Smith. And we're in the Beat movement. I've titled today's remarks, A Different America, Ginsberg's Poetic Prophecy and Patriotic Passion, Topics in American Lit. For anybody watching this later, we have a guest on the call who's a history colleague, and American literature, the way that we do it in this class, definitely bumps up against his discipline. So I want to ask for a lot of grace and a lot of breadth of wisdom and forgiveness. In the conversation later, if I make any errors, I'll call on the history colleague who's visiting our class today to give me some corrections on my course here. But today we're going to meet the most provocative of the beats that we're going to probably meet this semester, the Jewish, Buddhist, mystic, radical Allen Ginsberg, and one of the most popular poets in America. Now, towards his being a popular poet is not an easy hurdle to climb, and one that doesn't even come with a lot of reward, but he did make enough money on selling his private papers to Berkeley right before he died, enough to purchase an apartment in New York so he could live comfortably in his last years. And he passed away in 1997. I remember the day. I was working in a warehouse that shipped newspapers all over the world through the Nashville airport. And this was back when it was a big deal. You could go into a Borders or a Barnes and Noble or a Books A Million, and you could buy the Sunday paper from any city in America. I don't know that they offer that service anymore, but my company that I worked for at the time was shipping those all over, and I was a warehouse manager. And so I got the Sunday New York Times at about 5 o'clock on a Saturday, and I saw that Allen Ginsberg had died, and it was profound for me, having been his student at Naropa at the Jack Kerouac School in Boulder, Colorado. So on this first slide, that's what Allen Ginsberg looked like when I knew him. He was your grandfather. And when you read Howell with me on Wednesday, you're going to be like, you have a really weird grandfather. And I'm really excited that I saved a copy of his syllabus for the class that I taught in 1991. And it was in July in Naropa, and all he could do was photocopy his spring syllabus. So my colleague on the call can notice he didn't even make a new syllabus for summer class. He just photocopied the spring syllabus, and all the syllabus is a bunch of photocopies of stuff. I'm sure probably violating all kinds of copyright laws in doing so. And it was just a bunch of readings, including some of his own. And he was the kind of teacher who was prominent enough that he could photocopy his own book and put it in the syllabus. But I'm still really, really grateful that I saved my personal Allen Ginsberg syllabus from the summer of 1991. And that was exactly 30 years ago. So we can all feel old together, or at least the two of us on the call that are a little bit older. We don't do William S. Burroughs in this unit because I would say he might even be more controversial than Ginsberg of the beats. But his material is, one, very advanced and very difficult, but also I figure it's enough for us to tackle Allen, for whom I am an expert, and then to not try to tackle Burroughs, for whom I am not an expert. I was not an expert on Kerouac when I started this path of teaching this material, but I became one over the last, it's been about a dozen years now that I've been teaching this at the sophomore level. So grateful we brought a colleague on at Tech a couple of years ago who's a beat expert himself, and there was an upper division beat class that is now offered occasionally. And as I bragged to you guys last week, we had a student here at Tech become a beat studies expert, and she went on and got her MA in Kentucky, and she's getting her PhD now in Murfreesboro at MTSU in American Lit, and focusing on the beat writers. This is one of my favorite images. This was actually made on a postcard, and this was at one of the military academies in their required literature course. A bunch of military cadets taking, so this is at, lots of people do their ROTC here at Tech. But for people who see a career, you know, as an officer or what have you, they might attend one of our many military academies. And so if Ginsberg, weird and wild as he is, it can pass the muster to be taught at a military academy, he can pass the muster to be taught at Tennessee Tech. That's always what I've said. And I only say this because once you get into the material on Wednesday and even through today's lecture, you understand why he's provoked so many strong responses. And he's definitely one who is an acquired taste. Maybe, you know, the first time you tried macaroni and cheese, you didn't love it. You probably did love mac and cheese the first time you loved it. But maybe the first time you tried grandma's collard greens, you didn't love them. But now you love grandma's collard greens. Ginsberg is definitely the spinach or the collard greens of weird American poetry, insofar as it takes some time to really hang out with him in order to learn to appreciate him. And so today will be the kind of the introductory, where I'm going to provide at least a rationale for why you should be interested in him and why you should understand that he's a major contributor. Maybe of the semester, him and Kerouac are the most major contributors, because as later in the semester we're getting into more contemporary lit, people have, maybe their stars have not risen, but I think so. Maybe John Krakauer, his star is pretty. He's pretty much a big deal. And later on, Octavia Butler. When we first started teaching Butler years ago, she wasn't a big deal, but she certainly is now. When we get to Parable of the Sower later in the semester. So in the title for my talk, I used two very specific and very compelling and also very kind of elevated terms. I called Ginsberg a patriot, and this term in our culture today is very contested. What that means. People know that, you know, in the battles, in the street battles on all American cities, whether it would be in Portland last summer or in Washington, D.C. early this winter, this term gets bandied around and people don't necessarily agree on what it means. And so I just want to say that for my purposes, I'm meaning love and devotion to country. I'm not necessarily meaning a love and devotion of country that you've had to have proven through a certain set of actions, or even more so a certain set of sub allegiances, right? So we have a larger common tapestry, a quilt, a collage that is America. And within that quilted collage, we have different allegiances. I'm not talking about the allegiances within that. I'm talking about the greater allegiance of love and devotion to country. That's what I mean when I use that term. I just want to make sure that you understand the way I'm using that term. And I'm going to use the term prophet, has been used in the contemporary sense to refer to people like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the last century. Internationally, people in the last century used it to refer to a German, if you've never heard of him, by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who opposed the Nazis through writing and religious activism. This is a term that in our context basically means to speak truth to power. It does have a correlation to the Old Testament prophets, and Ginsberg's Judaism definitely puts him in allegiance with the Old Testament prophets, but it's not exactly the same. It's not a 1-to-1, but there is an association with the Hebraic scriptures that I will make today. But I want to make sure that we mean speaking truth to power, issuing a warning to one society that is provocative, sometimes blunt and bold, but not necessarily hateful. So we have to understand that Ginsberg appears to some people to be an anti-American. And I think we have to really wrestle with his words. And what I'm going to make the argument this morning in this morning's talk is that you don't become that harsh of a critic of an institution that you don't love. So that's where we're going. And of course, the disclaimer that kind of is underneath everything and above everything, the disclaimer and the trigger warning. And people have probably had other professors give trigger warnings. But I'm teaching English 1010 this semester, composition course. And a lot of my students are writing very personal memoirs. We're doing the assignment, which is personal writing this week and last week and the week before. And they'll be revising that up till their midterm. And they're writing very confessional stories. A lot of them involve personal details that disclosing takes a great amount of vulnerability and risk to do so. And so they've been giving their classmates trigger warnings before they read their papers and allowing them to opt out. Oh, goodness gracious, that didn't mean to happen. I went through all the slides like a rapid fire. We're just going to go back here all the way to the beginning. So I want to just say that you're not required to like any of this. What I want you to do is to attempt to engage in this. But I'm going to say that the joke I made earlier in the semester which is students are always opting out of controversial material, not necessarily because it's controversial, but because maybe they just don't have time to read the book. So I'm not going to micromanage whether or not you opt out of any of the reading that's controversial in this course. I just want to give you that warning. And of course, as I've said before, some students are like, I'm at least going to look. Now that he said, I might not have looked, Mr. Smith, to be honest with you. I might not have done my homework. But now that you have provided this, provocative thing for me, man, I'm going to go and I'm going to take a quick look here. So here is Allen, and here's the contradiction that you had definitely in the 60s. The beat movement bled into the hippie movement, and they would wear their Americanness very boldly. They were not ashamed of their allegiance of America. They would wrap themselves, in the flag, and there's a lot of controversy today. Is it blasphemous to put the American flag on a pair of running shorts, because you might sit down. People are very combative about how, we have the national anthem at major sporting events. What is the proper response? Is it okay for athletes to kneel during the anthem? These things have brought all kinds of things to the bear. But the hippie movement, a lot of them really embraced the flag. Maybe it was ironic, maybe it was critical. But is it wrong to put the flag on a paper top hat? I'm not going to be waging any judgment on this, but I want to just refer you to one of the poems in the textbook called America, and it has a very vulgar allusion to Ginsberg, and I'm going to offer to you not my interpretation of that poem, but the interpretation of one of my former students. And she said, I would never say that to anybody but my brother. The only person I would talk that way to is a sibling. And you'll find the poem. We'll probably get to it. Maybe we'll get to it on Wednesday. But it's the poem called America. It's part of the assigned readings, and he says something very raw. The first time you read it, it's like, ew, right? Why did he have to do that? And my student made the argument, and she wrote her paper on this topic. When you all will be writing your paper for midterm here soon, this is a topic. If you want to take it on, you could take the opposite approach to what my former student took. She argued that the Beats were inherently patriotic, and she used this analogy that has stuck with me for more than 10 years, that you only can criticize something so harshly that you have an investment in. I wouldn't bother to criticize the Colts game yesterday because I'm not invested in the Colts. But I surely spent all of last week criticizing the Browns game, against the Chiefs. I can criticize their game against the Texans yesterday, but they won. I'm invested in the Browns. I'm not invested in the Colts. And you're going to spend time caring about what you're invested in. And so sometimes patriotic love sounds angry. It sounds like hate, and this is why these terms are so contested. That's an allusion to the poem America. The poem Howell was published in a book called Howell and Other Poems in 1955. It was written. The birthday of the Beat generation is October 1955, when Kenneth Rexroth and Kerouac and others gathered with Ginsberg to have a reading in an art gallery. Howell made its worldwide debut at that October reading. It was published in 1956. An international shipment of the book, published by City Lights and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, was seized. And then the local police came and raided City Lights and arrested the store manager for offering an obscene book for sale. Maybe in a public library that you've been to before, a school library, they had banned books months. And maybe you grew up in a community where you had your librarian going out of her way to bring out the banned books. I told the class that I was reading Vonnegut when I was like 10, because I grew up in a community where they would, what was the other ones, Judy Blume or something like that, where the teachers would on purpose bring out the difficult texts, and because they were proud that they were not censoring them. But as today, there might be certain texts that you grew up with. You might have grown up in the community where no one was allowed to read, Harry Potter because of allusions to the occult. So witchcraft, things of this nature. So there's always been seasons where certain communities have excluded certain texts from what's being allowed to read. But this is a historic moment in the history of American letters, because this book was arrested. This book was seized. There was a trial, and the trial was made into a movie where I said the actor James Franco portrays Ginsberg. The John Hamm from Mad Men, if anybody's a Mad Men fan, portrays one of the attorneys. It's really quite a well done film, and it mostly focuses on the civil liberties and First Amendment aspect of this text. And so why was a book arrested? Why can a book be arrested? What would result in a book going to jail? We don't hear of that much anymore. I mean, there's things on your telephone that you can look up that you're like, why is this even allowed? Well, you can blame Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg and their attorneys in part. The book was arrested because it was considered to be obscene. And why wasn't the material considered obscene? Does anyone have any idea what that even means in our culture? I bet you do. I bet there were certain kinds of books and movies and shows that you grew up not being allowed to look at, and that whether as an adult you choose to look at that kind of material or not is up to you. It's a private decision. And this is why if a student doesn't want to read some of these lines, this is why when I read it with you on Wednesday, I'll bleep out and skip over whole sections. We've listened to Ginsberg read it before, but he doesn't bleep anything out. I had students watch that film before, but there's nothing bleeped out in that film. And if someone wants to go rent it on their own time, more power to you. But I've stopped showing that film in class because of so many students, got upset. So I figured out how to teach Ginsberg safely in class. And one of the things is to really emphasize this historic civil liberties aspect to it, because it changed the entire worldview on these texts. As a matter of fact, when Howell won its trial, it changed how other books were viewed. There were books that had been previously banned in the United States that were no longer banned anymore because it won its trial. So it's the SEX word, which is why the book, you guys probably figured that out on your own, but what was considered obscene in the book was references to body parts and to sexual activities. And why was it considered not obscene as literature, and it really moved the needle, is because it had an overarching artistic goal. The primary purpose of this book was not its aspect that referred in overt terms to human sexuality. So they won the trial because they argued compellingly that this was had a higher literary and social and moral purpose that had nothing to do with the rough parts of the text. This beautiful quote from one of Ferlinghetti and City Light's attorneys, recited in the film by John Hamm, says, "Let there be light, let there be honesty. Let there be no running from non-existent destroyers of morals. Let there be honest understanding. In the end, the four-letter words will not appear draped in glaring headlights." And you've probably grown up with video game questions, hip-hop music questions. You probably have had these kinds of questions for your entire growing up. And some of you probably still abstain from certain kinds of art and music or video games for those very reasons. And some of you don't. I remember growing up in my house, there was definitely an aversion to violence. And so I was allowed to look at things that had sexuality in them, but not things that had violence in them. And I had a buddy down the street from me, and his parents didn't care how much violence he consumed, but they didn't want him to look at sex. I mean, it's just one of those things that individual communities have shared standards around. And we decided as America that our shared value of freedom overarched over certain literary materials, making us uncomfortable. So Fairleigh Getty's going to argue, and many critics, there's a great critic named Alicia Ostriker that I've worked with, a Jewish critic. Many critics have argued that the poetic voice in Ginsberg is a prophetic voice, and that it's a prophetic voice modeled on the Old Testament. That's just a pun, using two words there, holy and holy. They're homonyms. Matter of fact, Marvin Gaye, the great American pop singer who we will look at a little bit in our allusions to pop music. We're making allusions all semester long to popular music, as that factors into your very creative final exam, the annotated mixtape. But the whole with a W refers to the entirety of everything. And then the holy means sacred or set aside. And so I'm going to take a slight detour here to the Old Testament, to this passage that says, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. And the reason why I'm reading this passage is because it has a kind of tone, a vigorous tone, that maybe is one of the influences on sort of the more angry portions, because actually, students have gotten offended by the sex in Ginsberg. They can also get offended by his vindictive, kind of acrimonious, hostility towards the institutions of society. So I just threw these lines in here. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. I bet somebody knows where this line, I hate and despise your festivals, comes from. Which text it comes from. If you know the text, the exact text, you can drop it in the chat. I do love reading your comments in the chat when we are on these meetings. And it is a text. Somebody gonna drop. They know exactly where it comes from. This is not the Bible quiz bowl at the Hooper Evelyn Center. I think they still have that. I don't know if they do, but they used to have some kind of Bible bowl over there at the Hoop. So it is the Bible. Does anybody know where in the Bible I stole that from? Oh, good job, Tristan. We have I hope Tristan doesn't mind me outing him as a PK to all of his colleagues, but we've got a PK on the call, and it was definitely the Book of Amos. And so Rex Roth, who is a poet and a fellow traveler, defined this in the trial documents, and in helping Fairleigh Getty defend this against its attacks. He says the simplest term for such writing is prophetic. The prophets of the Bible, which it greatly resembles in purpose and language and subject matter, the denunciation of evil and a pointing out of the consequences, and a call to repent. And so the prophets oftentimes had a very affectionate relationship with Israel. They had a loyalty and a love to Israel. And so it was out of that devotion to what they felt as the higher calling of Israel that they were so explicit in their ire at the failures and hypocrisies of their beloved nation. It is posited here that Ginsberg is out of his love for the land and the people and the shared, I'm calling it quilted collage, that is America, that he felt justified in writing this vindictive poem. And there's so many other things that have made it notorious and made it notable. In part, the use of language, the juxtaposition of nouns and adjectives in the particular Ginsbergian way that he does it, the long line that he stole from Whitman and from the jazz artists that he loved. There's many other things that make this a notable text, but it is a calling out of what he perceived as the sins of America. And this, of course, calls into stark relief that many people didn't like the so-called sins of Ginsberg, right? So we'll have to put these in scare quotes because we don't have, in a secular university, we don't have a shared understanding of what these terms mean, what that crime is exactly. But we'll get to that briefly as I move through these remarks in hopefully a timely enough manner that we can have a little bit of conversation at the end. But growing up with a little bit of censorship in the home is something that you all can relate to, as you can see from one of your excellent comments from one of your peers. And so I have abided a Rex Rothian interpretation of this poem. This is prophetic. This does copy in style and in intent the Old Testament prophets, even though obviously some details are extreme departures. And I've maintained this thesis in teaching this material for many, many years. And some of our students have either misunderstood the argument or taken great umbrage to the argument. They're like, can't go there with you, Mr. Smith. And so as you're considering this, if you decide to write about the beats for your paper, good people can disagree. That's the definition of an academic controversy. This is a topic on which good people can disagree. So here's Lewis Hyde, and he's a literary scholar who is not a prude, right? He's not reacting against Rex Roth, saying that Ginsberg is a prophet. He's just calling out a little bit of the obvious. And Hyde says, and I've only paraphrased a little bit, or I'm sorry, quoted a little bit of Hyde here in his book on the trickster. He says, the context of Rex Roth's assertion was the carnival of mass democracy. Ginsberg is prophetic the way that coyote or trickster is, getting out of his cage by calling down the chaotic everything. And what Hyde is arguing is he's prophetic, but not in an Old Testament way. That's what he's basically saying. He's saying that the indigenous trickster motif is a much more accurate rendering of the kind of prophet or the court jester, the Joker in the deck, or the film, the last film with Joaquin Phoenix, very controversial movie. The Joker in the Joaquin Phoenix version of that character is a trickster. He is a outsider who uses rhetorical, and at least in the case of the film, material means for sowing chaos. And it's sometimes hard to see the good, to see the redeeming qualities. And maybe there are no redeeming qualities in trickster. Now, in Lewis Hyde's book, there are going to be redeeming qualities in trickster. He spent an entire book celebrating the trickster in American culture. But he says that's a more accurate rendering of Ginsberg than the Old Testament prophets, is the more indigenous trickster motif. Because basically he says you might find, how did he put it there? He said you might find a monk, at a monastery saying that everything is holy, as Ginsberg does at the end of this poem, but you're not going to find a monk saying that those body parts are holy in the way that Ginsberg does. So how does Allen get us to this place where in the mid and late 50s, he's going to be catapulted into fame and notoriety that he will ride out for the remainder of his career, to be this misfit Jewish, Buddhist, anti-authoritarian, homosexual prophet? I mean, even throwing all those words together makes, some of us, a little bit squeamish. Many times in sacred literature, if you have somebody that is known as a prophet, they have some kind of an anointing or they have some kind of a vision. Well, Ginsberg claims to have had a vision where the British romantic William Blake, and I did reference him on last Friday because of the Kenneth Patchen unit, because of the picture poems that we looked at on last Friday, Blake uses imagery and blends it in with poetry. Well, Ginsberg claims that, and Blake is deceased by Ginsberg's time. Ginsberg claims that Blake came to him in a vision. Now, you might say you have a vision, and like I would say, oh, I've had a vision. It's kind of subtle, it's kind of a inclination or an intuition. It's kind of a internal nudging, and it's not like voices in the head where you have to go to the doctor. And it's definitely not like, the voice of Morgan Freeman all of a sudden coming through like speakers in the ceiling, and saying, it is God, or James Earl Jones, like out of like The Lion King or something, like, ladies and gentlemen, God, God is in the room. It was when I was growing up, it was George Burns talking to John Denver in a grocery store. Go look that up. It's a movie called Oh God. So that doesn't happen, right, to most of us. It's a much more subtle, and it requires a lot of self-discipline. Well, he actually claims he had a vision from Blake, and that was what propelled him to have the courage and the audacity to follow these images to their conclusion in his mind. I'm going to try to summarize the arc of the whole poem. The poem is broken up into sections. The first section is the best minds of your generation section. The Ginsberg poems, of course, in your textbook begin on page on page 60. So the long section of the poem is number one, the best minds of your generation section, and then there's a whole section number two called Moloch. Moloch, again, a Canaanite god, kind of an Old Testament image, a false idol, and he names Moloch, and he talks about very specific critiques of America that he has in the Moloch section. And then he moves into this realm in part three. So it's a multi-part poem for human love and human solidarity, where he says, Carl Solomon, I am with you in Rockland. And keeping in mind that it's not like, hey, brah, I got you, right? You might be walking through the cafeteria today and see somebody you had class with last semester, or somebody you played intramurals with, or somebody you saw, at church or whatever. You might give them, the fist bump or the bro hug or whatever. And you'll say, man, I got your back. We say that kind of stuff all the time, but then when the rubber meets the road, sometimes we aren't able to, they've got COVID now or whatever. Can you go to the hospital? You can't. Can you text them? Are you texting with their, the grandparents, Ginsberg's friend Solomon, who was in he's in the mental hospital. He's in the joint, right? He's restrained by mental health concerns such that he does not have the freedoms that we enjoy. Freedoms of movement, daily autonomies that we have so much privilege, y'all. So many daily autonomies that we maybe don't take inventory of to give thanks for. Well, Solomon does not have those freedoms because he is in the mental hospital. And notice that he uses these repetitions very much in parts 2 and 3. There's a chant. We'll be talking on Friday about what the chant poetry actually is. Well, Ginsberg is one of the people I learned the chant genre from. And then, of course, there's the very famous, footnote, which gets him into all kinds of trouble, where he goes and names all of these things that he believes to be holy and sacred. Now, we're going to loop back around on Wednesday and start with Howell on Wednesday. But not only is all of these things holy, but holy is also the supernatural, extra brilliant, intelligent kindness of the soul. Now, as I'm going to conclude here in a couple of minutes, I want to use the remainder of class to answer questions and to help gain context. And as I said at the beginning of the call, some of you got on the call late. We have a guest on the call today, and he wanted to visit me for professional reasons. So I'm really hoping you all will indulge him and me in a little bit of a conversation here at the end. I did want to drop some 50-cent words, because it wouldn't be a Mr. Smith lecture if he doesn't use some big words that you have to look up later and define anything. I'll clarify anything that you need. But Stephen D. Eddington wrote a book about the spirituality of the Beat movement called The Beat Face of God. And he uses a 50-cent theology school word called panentheism. It is not pantheism, and it is not your traditional theism of a God above and a God outside of our reality. And this is just a definition that he says applies to the Beats. Because when I talked about the Beat movement religiously in the past, I think people, maybe they shut down because they're like, well, this is nothing like church. So therefore, I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Smith. I'm not going to go there with you. Well, I want you to go there with us to entertain the possibilities that this unit provides, not to necessarily endorse it, not necessarily to condone it, not necessarily to co-sign any of these more flagrant indulgences that we notice in these texts, but to at least entertain where they're coming from and why they're important and how they've helped shape America. Because I think Ginsberg, in a sense, contributes to American religious pluralism because he's a Buddhist and Jewish, and we said that about Kerouac. Kerouac, of course, being Catholic and Buddhist. Okay. So Eddington says, God is the presence of the holy, the divine, of the sacred within our world or universe in which we live and move and have our being. The $10 word for this stance is panentheism. I'm pretty sure that none of the Beats ever use such a term, but it does describe the religious or spiritual dimension contained in much of their writing. So please, class, come prepared to be a little bit less formal and more interactive on Wednesday, and bring your textbook to the call. But please stay on the call now, and let's engage in a little bit of a Q&A or conversation before you go. So don't anybody jump off the call just yet. I'll try to find the button I'm looking for where I could stop the recording for today.